Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Sturzenegger, dear Federico, welcome to Vienna. We are deeply honored that you made the long journey from Buenos Aires to Vienna to be with us here tonight. When Argentina comes up in conversation in Austria, the country divides. Some reach for their heart or blood pressure medications. Others, as me, can barely contain their excitement because they see that radical reform is possible after all. But what unites all of us is the sense that Argentina is very far away from Austria, not just geographically, but also politically. And of course, there is something to it. We don't have a peso that loses value week by week, even if inflation seems to be more stubborn than we would like to be. We know nothing of rates of 250% and more by year. Our GDP per capita is about 4 times higher than Argentina's. Even adjusted to purchasing power, it is still 2.3 times as high. Our last sovereign default does not lie a couple of years behind us, but more than a century. So far, so comforting. Less comforting is a look at the core fiscal data. Austria, with public spending of 55% of GDP, is more state-heavy than Argentina was at its darkest. Our budget deficit currently stands at 4.2%. The 2 years before Milei took over in Argentina, it was about 4%. And we in Austria, we are still happy that it's not higher than the 4.2%. The budget deficit in Argentina has been eliminated not by raising taxes and fees, like in Austria, but by cutting public spending. Our public debt to GDP ratio matches Argentina's. On the share of state ownership of listed companies, over 1/5 in both countries. When it comes to the entanglement of state and economy to bureaucracy and overregulation, Argentina needs no lessons from us. It's rather the opposite. While our inflation rates still remain lower than Argentina's, Austria seems to be caught in the same cycle of inflation and stagnation that has plagued Argentina for decades. So Buenos Aires, I would say, is closer to Vienna than many would like to admit. Which brings us to the key question. If the starting conditions are not so different, what can we learn from what's happening in Argentina right now? Federico Sturzenegger has not come to us to tell how bad things were. He has come to us to tell us what can be done about it. How to get a country back on track after decades of mismanagement. How to read laws not as a lawyer, but as an economist. Asking the simple but decisive question, do we actually need this? Or does this rule mainly protect those who drafted it in the first place? And he will tell us what happens when you act on the answers to all those questions consistently. The results after 2.5 years are, with all that remains open, impressive. And that deserves an honest discussion, not ideological, not reflexive, but with an open mind. Federico, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm from Argentina, so never ask any economic advice from an Argentine, okay? Because as you know, we've been the worst student in the class for the last 50 years. We never turned in the homework. We got in every fight that we could in any class break. So we're not a role model for anything. But that behavior really took us through a path of stagnation and poverty. I always mention when I was born in '66, Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. In fact, I was 10 years old and still Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. And today the income level of Argentina is 1/3 that of Spain. So certainly they're not doing the homework, and this idea of fighting with everybody at every opportunity didn't do well with us. And in the 10 years prior to Milei becoming president, 2 million Argentines left the country. And the people that left the country were our sons and daughters. It was our grandchildren, it was our nieces. And at some point we realized that if we didn't do a very significant change, we were going to see our grandchildren grow over a Zoom, maybe in Madrid, or maybe in Barcelona, or maybe in Milan. And this is the reason why people decided to vote for very radical change in December of 23, and that's how Milei, he claims to be the first libertarian economist to be president of any country in the world, became president. And so the idea of the talk today is to tell you the journey we've kind of gone through over these last 2 years in an economic program which has, I would say, 2 big pillars which feed into a third one. So the first one has to do with, I'm going to go into detail in just a second, but the first one has to do with fiscal soundness. You were mentioning, France, that you have a deficit here, but you cannot imagine what the deficit looks like in Argentina for 100 years. And President Milei said, well, listen, my fiscal rule is very simple. I'm always going to have a fiscal surplus. So he cut government expenditure by 30% in his first month, and he achieved 5% of GDP. He achieved a fiscal surplus, and we've kept the fiscal surplus since then. So before I go on, let me just show you a few data of what has been happening in the country. Oh, I hope I don't fall here. So let me just show you some data. Here, the upper left. Okay, so the pointer I think is not working here. So the upper left graph is inflation. So you see we inherited an economy where inflation was not only rampant, but was escalating. When Milei became president, inflation was running, this is not a joke, at 1.5% per day. Okay, and so it was really escalating. You see we kind of went close to 300%. Now we've brought this down to 30%, so very successful. The second graph is output. So I'm not showing the last 15 years, but Argentina has been stagnant. I mean, has had no economic growth in 15 years. And then you can see that the economy has resumed the growth trajectory. It grew 6.6% in the first year of the Milei administration and 3.5% in the second year of the Milei administration. If the projections of macroeconomists kind of bear out, he will finish his first term with the economy growing 20%, I repeat, after 15 years of stagnation. And something which is quite interesting is that if you see the graph on the right, its exports, which also had been stagnant for a long time, really they're taking off. And exports are growing at a rate which is 8 times the rate of growth of GDP. So we're kind of in the middle of an export-led growth, which is much more sustainable because, I mean, the world for us is infinite. And this is a new one for Argentina. Well, here in the lower panel, you have the deficit. So you see we were coming from this very large deficit and kind of cold turkey. They were changed from one day to the next, and we kept it that way. And the interesting thing is that, and I'm going to talk more about this in just a second, when you reduce government expenditure, because Milei say, I'm going to have a fiscal balance, but you have 2 ways of achieving a fiscal balance. You can have a fiscal balance through reducing government expenditure, or you can have a fiscal balance by increasing taxes. And Milei say 100%, not 99%. Well, actually 150% of the adjustment is going to be on government expenditure. And why do I say 150%? Because the guy wants to lower taxes as well. So you have to do more than what you need to balance the budget. Okay? So this adjustment has been done by reducing government expenditure. Now the magic, and I think I'm going to explain that this is the most popular thing that you can do in your life. Look, the most popular thing a politician can do is to reduce government expenditure. Why? Because every expenditure has to be financed. So when you reduce government expenditure, you reduce the taxes that you have to charge people to pay for those expenditures. And reducing taxes is very popular. So for example, when we reduce government expenditure 5% of GDP in 1 month, that meant that we didn't need anymore to have money printing, which was financing half of the deficit. And the money printing was generating inflation. So when we stopped printing money, that's how inflation came down. And inflation is a tax on the poor. So when you remove this tax on the poor, the poverty rate plummeted. And you see here the poverty rate had reached kind of 52, 53%, has come down to 29%. It's the biggest decline in poverty in the statistical record that we have of poverty rates in Argentina. And this was done because of the chainsaw. By the way, I don't know if you see here, I have a pin, which is a chainsaw, okay, which I wear proudly, my chainsaw. You're supposed to laugh, okay? And so reducing government expenditure through the chainsaw basically allows us to reduce the taxes. An important tax that we reduced was money printing, was the inflation tax, and that basically implied a huge improvement in the actual incomes of the poorest in the society, and that's why poverty fell. So there isn't anything more popular than reducing government expenditure, because Milei says, look, Milei says the politicians are amazing. Look at what the politician convinced us. They convinced us that getting into our pockets and taking the money from us so that they spend our money was good for us. So that the politicians spend our money, they convince us that that's much better than me reducing what the politicians spend so I can give back people and I don't have to take the money out of the people. So he says, Milei, oh, these guys are geniuses, okay? That they've brainwashed our mind and convinced us that giving the money to the politician was good for us. No, man, give me back my money. That I know how to spend it much better than the politicians. The second big theme I talk about economic freedom, which is the deregulation agenda. And I want to say the following, that first of all, the deregulation agenda is an anti-corruption agenda, because each regulation is an opportunity for some. I probably here in Austria you don't have this problem, but this is a serious problem in Argentina. But well, I don't know. I take the Fifth Amendment. Okay, so in Argentina, I mean, anything that means that you have to move a paper from one desk to the other is an opportunity for someone asking for some help for the Sunday barbecue. Okay, and so eliminating the regulation is anti-corruption. Okay, but the other thing, it's basically very much in favor of small firms. Why? Because all the regulations, 100% of the regulations are anti-competitive, because they generate a cost, and they generate a cost of entry. So they restrict, but 100%, there's no one which is not that. And so for a big firm which has its compliance department, it has the lawyers, maybe it's not such a big thing. But for the entrepreneur, the guy who's starting, which are the guys who are going to challenge the market, are the guys who are going to steer things, are going to shake the economic environment, with the regulation, you kill those guys or you make it very difficult for them, because for them, that's a hurdle that's very difficult to pass. So regulation is very much anti-small firms, it's very much anti-entrepreneurship, it's very much anti-growth. It's a shit, okay? Excuse my French. You know, I like when Elon Musk, if you read the biography of Elon Musk, and he's working with the engineers in Tesla, and he says, the best peace is no peace. So that has to be the spirit, okay? And the other thing that he says, that he only congratulates the engineers which simplify a process so much that they have to come to him and say, look, I made a mistake, you know? I simplified too much, I realized this, I cannot simplify, I have to put it back. So you need to simplify as much and test yourself really how much was necessary to reinstate. If you never are in the phase that you have to reinstate something that you eliminated, you don't have the slightest idea, maybe you're halfway of what you should have done. Okay, so this is a few numbers on this thing, which is the chart on the left is the number of public employees that we've spared off. So out of 300,000, we've kind of we have 65,000 less. So it's more than 20% of the labor force. Nothing that the government does has been affected by this. So kind of that's the biggest proof that all this was waste. The reduction of this is more like $2.5 billion in savings, which means that it's $2.5 billion of less taxes that I have to charge people to pay for this. And what do people do when they have $2.5 billion in their pockets? They go out and spend it in useful things, not in useless things. Because here, by taking the money to giving it to the politicians, we were spending the money on useless things. Okay, we give it back to people and they spend it on things that they want to spend it on, and that's useful. Okay, so this is kind of the jobs. And then what I have here on the right is my deregulation effort. I've eliminated 15,000 regulations. How do I measure a regulation here? It's when you go to a law, and the law has an article which obliges the private sector to do something. Oh, you have to register here, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. Well, when I eliminate that article, I count that as a deregulation. We've done 15,000 of those. So I think it's really kind of one of the most ambitious, aggressive, and successful deregulations. By the way, right now, as we speak, the Chamber of Representatives is voting a law that I sent to Congress. I didn't know I was going to vote exactly when I was speaking here, okay, when we arranged this with Franz 6 months ago, and which eliminates out of 100 laws. So I kind of got rid of 100 laws. So I will let you know when we finish in the dinner if I got the votes or not. Yeah, we have the votes. I'm pretty sure we have the votes. Okay. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about regulation. And the first thing I want to let you know is that, or I want to share with you, and I don't know again if we can bring this completely to Austria or not. So this is for Argentina. That regulation is not the result of a benevolent central planner thinking how to do good. It's not that. Regulation is most of the times the result of some interest which uses the state as a vehicle to generate a regulation that benefits them. And I'm going to give you an example in the next slide, which I think is pretty clear on this. And I say that these interests, which kind of build this regulation, they operate as Velociraptor. Everybody saw the Jurassic Park movie, correct? Raise your hands. Everybody has seen the Jurassic Park, okay? Great movie. So I remember that the guy which was taking care of the Velociraptor said, these guys are very smart, and they test the fence. They constantly test the fence until they find the weakness in the fence. I don't know if you remember that line in the movie. So the interests are like Velociraptors because they kind of keep pounding, no? So they come to my office to see if they can get a regulation. I kick them away. So they go to the other minister to see if they convince them if they can get it. If they go to the executive, another minister. If they don't convince the executive, they go to Congress to see if they can get a law. If they can do it with this government, they try again with the next government. And eventually, they kind of break the fence and they get the regulation which provides some privileges for them. And then you're doomed, because once you have that privilege, you create rents. And then they use these rents to perpetuate the protection. So once the Velociraptor has broken the fence, there's no way to put in the genie back into the bottle, okay? Because the rents kind of are used to sustain this, okay? So not a central planner. Regulation is motivated by interest. And I'm going to show you this example, which I think is absolutely mind-boggling. It's amazing. You know, Argentina is a large country. There are only 47 million Argentines. If you place Argentina over Europe, it stretches from Portugal to Estonia. So you get an idea of the size, okay? 47 million people, so very thinly populated. Yet in Argentina, it was forbidden, the government had forbidden the use of satellite internet, say Starlink, to name a household name or the most successful company. And you say, why on earth? Who on earth can be so evil to get this country with thinly populated, with very remote areas in the mountains, in the Pampas, in Patagonia, and forbid satellite internet? So who was it? Well, it was the largest media group in Argentina, who are the biggest providers of internet. So for them, it was much easier to convince the regulator, and probably the guy who did the regulator is someone who earns $1,000 a month of income. So it's much easier to convince a guy which earns $1,000 per month to issue a regulation saying that no one in Argentina can buy Starlink than competing with Elon Musk. You never want to compete with Elon Musk. Okay? So we had this regulation. So if you look at 2003, there was no users of Starlink in Argentina. And Javier Milei, in his 10th days in government, he breaks that piece of paper and kind of lets the market free. And there you see the users in 24. There you see the users in 2025. And I think that if we do the 2026, which I still don't have the data, basically it's only going to be all black, because you have many people in Argentina that the only way they can get is through satellite internet. How much money did the government spend? Zero. How much money did the previous government spend laying out fiber optics? $7 billion. So we were spending $7 billion of taxpayer money to do something which was useless, because you had an alternative technology which didn't require any government investment, okay? And today, 3 million Argentines get internet through this mechanism, and I tell you, it's 3 million votes. Because for someone who's in a remote area who had to do 50, 60 kilometers to get to a place where you had internet connection, and you realize that the only reason was that because the government didn't forbid, and you had to bring this guy called Javier Milei to say, I don't care about who's behind or whose interest is behind, I'm going to let people choose freely what internet they want, and they did. Okay, so we worked for 2 years, and by December of 2023, we had everything mapped out. So we had the laws that had to go, and we had a proposed change in the legislation of the laws that we thought had to be changed. Okay. Now, why I think this is very important? This is very important because of something that I called the principle of Marx. I made this up, okay? It's the principle of Marx. So I put this up, and you may think I'm referring to Karl Marx, but not, actually not. It's not Karl Marx I'm talking about. So you may think I'm referring to Groucho Marx. I think even the age group of this audience, I'm safe to say that you know who Groucho Marx is, okay? No, it's not Groucho Marx. So I'm actually talking about Daniel Marx. And you say, who is Daniel Marx? And I say, Daniel Marx is a friend of mine whose last name happens to be Marx, okay? So what's the story of, what is the Marx principle? So in 2001, I was Secretary of Economic Policy in the national government, and Daniel was the Secretary of Finance. So one day we have a very big discussion with the finance minister, which was a legendary figure. Some of you may have heard the name, a guy called Domingo Cavallo. Okay? So he was the finance minister, so we have a big fight, which lasted maybe 4 hours, sweating, and we were discussing A or B, A or B, A or B, 4 hours discussion. We finally conclude we have to do A. Fine. Next morning, the minister signs the bill, or the whatever it is that he had to sign, and it was B. I said, so I go running to Daniel, and I say, Daniel, what happened? I mean, didn't we decide A? Didn't we say, yeah. So someone tricked us. No, he says, no, what happened is that Horacio Liendo, which was the legal secretary of Cavallo, had come to Cavallo with a decree, and the decree said B. So Cavallo, he has the paper in front, he has to act, A, B, sign B. So what is the lesson? And I think this is the most important thing I've learned in politics, which is that the person that wins the debate is the person that puts the paper on the table. I mean, having great ideas and do this, do that, useless, completely useless. What you have to put on the table is the paper that the politician needs to sign to proceed. And if you are the one, and because no one is going to do that job, everybody has great ideas, but then you have to sit down and work the thing. It takes a lot of work. So you know nobody's going to do it. So whoever puts the paper on the table is going to win the debate. So you've won 85% of the intellectual debate. No, not 85, 95% of the intellectual debate by putting the table, because you force everybody else to discuss on the basis of your proposal. So they may touch things on the margin, but you've already won the debate. So this is my principle of Marx, and I said I'm going to do the principle of Marx to a galactic level, okay? Which is I'm going to do the principle Marx on the whole legal system of Argentina. So what I'm going to tell you is how did I did that in 2 years with 7 people, 4 law students of the university where I was teaching, which is Universidad de San Andrés, a constitutional law professor, and my TA from my Principle in Economics course. And we had the hefty budget of 0. Okay, so we had no money, we were 7 people, and we had the aim, in 1.5 years, we had to have a whole review of the legal system done, okay? So what you have to sit and start reading. And the first thing that you may think that this is a very difficult job. And I tell you, no, it's not a difficult job. I mean, it takes time because it's a lot of laws, but it's not difficult. Why? Because the laws are so grotesque, are so clearly the result of an interest that has pushed, that when you read it, you say, this is ridiculous. So it's very simple to figure out what you have to do. Let me just say another example. In our constitution, which is a great constitution, it's a very liberal constitution, says, for example, that you have freedom of commerce. You can do activities, you can. So why do you need a law to regulate an industry if the industry is free? Everything is free, okay? But at some point in our minds kind of got confused, and the military have a lot to do with this, so they started doing these laws that say, yeah, the Constitution allows you to do this, but let's do the following. We are going to prohibit this activity. Unless you register. So you want to do candies? The Constitution says I can do candies. No, you can only do candies if you register as a candy producer, okay? Now, if you register as a candy producer, fine, you can do all the candies that you want, okay? So you create a registry of candy producers, you create a government agency to manage the registrar of the candy producers, and a number of sanctions for those candy producers which have not signed in the registrar. And you find this over and over and over again, and you say, why the heck do we need a register of candy producers? So, very easy. So you need to have some basic principles to kind of give guidance to this work. So for us, it was a very liberal principles. So we wanted to foster competition, eliminate barriers to entries. We wanted to avoid economic transfer. We want prices to kind of signal where resources should be allocated and not kind of hidden things, and things that are not very transparent. That's why I say increased transparency in government spending. Everything that we could do to reduce government expenditure, we also was the benchmark there. And as Milei says, we never tackled this as, let's try to simplify this law. We always ask ourselves first, should this law exist in the first place or not? So we really went deep in that. It was also easier to get rid of it completely. So I mean, we had an incentive to ask that question. So in Argentina, we have a beverage which is called Yerba Mate. It's like an energizing weed that we drink. Like a Red Bull, South American version, okay? So this is an industry which is in the northeast of Argentina. It's very competitive, thousands of producers, tens of thousands of producers, hundreds of brands, distributors, etc. So what does the government do when you have a competitive industry? It transforms it into a monopoly. So the government created El Instituto Nacional de la Yerba Mate, the National Institute of Yerba Mate, where it sat everybody to do what? To increase the price. So, I mean, I go to the university, I read, I have these courses on antitrust. and antitrust and how, firms interact to avoid competition, all that. And in front of my eyes, the government is taking a competitive industry and transforming it into a monopoly. You tell me, can you have something more grotesque than that? So what Milei did in this executive decree that I'm mentioning for the third time now, he didn't eliminate the institute, but he eliminated the power of the institute to intervene in the prices. And what happened is that the price fell to half. So we learned that this institute, the only thing was doing was doubling the price of this product. And you can imagine that this was not taken lightly by some of the producers. But all is well that ends well, because once the domestic price fell, the industry started looking outwards. And today, well, by the way, a footnote, there was also a prohibition to increase production. So we also got rid of that, okay? And so the industry started looking outwards, and now we have record production and we have record exports. The second thing is, who can help me? So my first temptation was to go to the big law firms. Whoa. Totally useless. Look, worse than useless. It was worse because these guys, they cash and their fees are for sale in a very complicated system. So I would sell them something, they would give me something twice as difficult. But no, useless. I tried twice, I forgot. These guys are totally useless. They're never going to tell me how to simplify a system. And in fact, so the second alternative is the expert. Useless. Because the expert has already so much of his human capital vested in a system that probably he will try to improve it on the margins, but he'll never tell you, get rid of this. This is total bullshit. That's my job, okay? Anyway, so who helped me? The victims. So say the commercial lawyer who was fed up, who knew all the paperwork he had to file, and he knew it was totally useless because nobody looked at it. The victims of the system were the guys that did the job with a challenging mind, with a revolutionary mind, and this was the profile of people that helped me, okay? So, and the end product was this. So by the time the President Milei was about to be sworn in, I walked into his office and I put these two piles of paper on the table. I've known President Milei for a while, since the time I was governor of the central bank, so we were good friends. I said, Javier, this is what has to be done. And we had a 6-hour meeting where we went over everything that was in this project. And then this was a fundamental input of two pieces of legislation, the executive decree that I've already mentioned several times, and the basis law that we sent to Congress 10 days later, which were a little bit of a political shock, because it's like you have this outsider that comes, and a lot of people said, well, this guy have the team, will have the energy, will have the preparation to get a reform agenda on the table. And then on the first 20 days of the government, we issue the executive decree and we take the basis law, and it was a big shock to the political system. And they had to bend, because we were just coming from an election where the president had been elected with 55% of the vote. So we got a tremendous amount of reforms done. And I call it the surprise factor, because you have to act fast before those interests even have time to react. So this was so marvelous, okay? Here you have, so I'm finishing now, Franz, but just show you some effects of the micro deregulation. No? So for example, here I have the price of the Yerba Mate, which I mentioned, that you see how it fell 50%. Here is the price of clothing, the price of appliance, the price of iron, the price of medicine. This over here is a fantastic example, because we had a rent control law. And the rent control law had basically withdrawn the rentals from the market because it was too tight, etc. So in the executive decree, we basically eliminated any law. Listen, no law associated to rentals. You have the civil code and the commercial code, which regulates commercial contracts, and we say a rental contract is a commercial contract. You don't need a special law for the rentals. So that means that you could write the rental for the time you wanted, in the way that you wanted, paid in the way you wanted, in the terms you wanted. And it's interesting because the people who proposed the law, they always said, oh, the tenant is weaker than the land owner. And I say, I don't know, in economics, I have supply and demand. And I never had the concept, supply is stronger than demand. There's a supply and there's a demand, and there's an equilibrium. What is this thing that the supply is stronger or the demand is stronger? Bullshit. And so we eliminated everything. What happened to rental prices in this free world? They came down 30%. And they came down, and what you see here is the supply of rentals, which is the orange line, so you see it skyrocketed immediately. And the price of rentals fell in a month's time. So it was a tremendous success for President Milei, because it says freedom works. One day, a guy writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with my watermelons? So I was intrigued. So I write back and say, what's the problem with your watermelons? How can I be of help? They don't taste any good. There's nothing I can do about that. Oh, he writes back, my watermelons are great. In fact, I'm an exporter of watermelons. So I said, so what's your problem? That's through email, correct? And the guy was kind of throwing me the data. No, the problem is that for the last 10 years, I've been trying to convince the agricultural department to let me package the watermelons the way my client abroad wants the watermelons packaged, because apparently there's a regulation which says that the watermelons have to be packaged in a particular way that the military thought about in 1983. And he says below, P.S., Federico, we're not talking about enriched plutonium here. It's just watermelon, so who on earth cares how you package the watermelon? So he says, I've been 10 years going through the offices of the government trying to tell them, let me package the water. So I don't have, so I said, what do you do? You're not exporting? No, I am exporting, yeah. So what do you do? Well, what I do is I package the watermelons the way the government wants them to be packaged. I put them on the boat, and when the boat leaves the port, 100 meters, I ask the boat to stop. I send 70 guys. The guys unpack and repack, okay? So I'm reading this now, and kind of my eyes are swelling. I have tears in my eyes. And I look at my team and I said, this story has to be true, because it's impossible to imagine this, okay? So it has to be true. And it was fascinating because I started looking into this, and then I realized that he was touching the tip of the iceberg. You know, the iceberg has 10% above the surface and 90% beneath. So I asked for all the regulation on fruit production to be printed, and it was 2.5 kilos of paper. So it's a pile this big. So you need a PhD in literature before becoming a fruit producer, so you can read all those volumes. And so I sat down with the Food and Drug Administration, say, what should the government do with fruit production? And he said 2 things. I had the big pile in the back. Only 2 things, yes. I need to know who produces where. So if I have a plague, I can coordinate with the producers to contain the plague. And I also have to do the phytosanitary certificates when you export, because you don't want in Rotterdam to open a container of apples and it's full of fleas because they're going to close the market. That's it. That's it. So I threw to the garbage all the other regulation, and I wrote a regulation which was 2 pages, which was these 2 things, okay? And a few months later, this guy sent me this video. So I want to share the video with you.
Hoy es un día histórico para la localidad de Juan José Castel y Chaco. Esta sandía es la primera sandía en la historia que se logra exportar al país vecino de Uruguay. Y queríamos darles las gracias exclusivas a nuestro presidente de la Nación, Javier Milei, a nuestro ministro de Deregulación, Federico Sturzenegger, porque sin ello esto no hubiese sido posible. Específicamente, Federico logró disolver muchas trabas burocráticas que teníamos en aduana, y hoy un sueño que se transformó en realidad, hoy es un hecho concreto. Esperemos exportar muchos equipos más. Así que, Federico, querido, infinitamente gracias, y este videito es para vos.
It's fantastic. And actually, a journalist from the New York Times came to visit me, and he was spending some time in Argentina. I told him the story of the watermelon, so he said, I'm going to go and visit this guy, okay? I want to start Milei's campaign in 2027 here, in this town in Chaco with this guy, okay? And he went and interviewed, and you will see the pictures of this guy in the New York Times magazine a few weeks ago. And he rings me up from Chaco and says, this guy is going to be the next president of Argentina. So that's the guy's very, but again, maybe this is a great video to finish the presentation, because it shows that deregulation is the most popular thing that you can do. Basically, we've eliminated the restrictions, and they have a guy in Chaco in the middle of Argentina, in the middle of the field, thanking you just for getting the government out of the way. So I don't know if there's a lesson from that, and but certainly in the case of Argentina, as I said at the beginning, the economy has grown 10%, exports are growing 8 times as fast as output, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we freed the Argentines to be able to do all the great things that they can do. Thank you.
You mentioned the victims that helped you the most, but how did you fend off all the interest groups that benefited from the regulations before? Because there must be a lot of resistance.
Yeah, again, very important, the resistance is not from the people. The people are your supporters, so the faster you move the regulation, the more political capital you build. So the resistance are of the interest. So the fight with the resistance is in the backstage. And the people are your biggest allies. Now, in my case, the way I've managed to do these 15,000 regulations is because I work for someone who's, fuera de serie, what would be, it's kind of, he's from another world, which is Javier Milei. And also because the world is very different from what it was 15 or 20 years ago. We have social media, which allows for a direct contact between government and the people. So we've de-intermediated the press. We can circumvent the press completely. We can have a conversation with the people direct. So what happens with Milei is that, for example, I announce a deregulation, and of course, the newspapers immediately smell the blood, correct? Because they know that the deregulation, there's going to be someone affected. I repeat, the people who are going to benefit are the population at large. The one who's going to be affected are the interests which had generated the regulation to protect and generate the rent. And as soon as it gets in the newspaper, President Milei is retweeting that news supporting the deregulation. And that for me is a formidable, I mean, that's all I need. Because these guys say, who am I going to lobby in the government when President Milei himself is endorsing the deregulation? So it somehow kind of dilutes the resistance of this interest. I tell Javier, it's like you're walking ahead of me with your machete and you're clearing the path ahead of me. And the reason I can move fast is because you're doing the heavyweight, because I'm just kind of operational. You're making it operational. But he's kind of taking the brunt of the political support for the deregulation. So you need someone like that, which is totally convinced, 100% convinced about the need of freedom in Argentina. And in fact, he has this dream of showing to the rest of the world that freedom works. But he's my biggest ally, and without him, I would not have been able to do anything. So the 2 million people, that left, I was telling a story to a journalist earlier this evening, which is, there's this movie called The Nucleus. No? Okay. No? Anybody has seen it?
No.
I'll tell you the argument, maybe you remember. The nucleus of the Earth stops spinning. So they have to kind of go to the nucleus and kind of, with some atomic bombs, they were going to make the nucleus. Someone now, do you remember the movie? Okay. That's a Hollywood movie. So they kind of build a ship that's going to go to the center of the Earth. It's obviously full of scientists, correct? That are going there. And so they're coming into the Earth, and then one of the scientists says, well, what a burden we have on our shoulders. Because if we fail, 7 billion people are going to die. And then the French, the French are always kind of beyond good and evil, correct? And so the French guy, which was kind of more senior, says, 7 billion people. I couldn't care less about the 7 billion people. I'm not here to save 7 billion people. So the other scientist says, so what are you here for? I'm here to save 2, my wife and my daughter. And I think that those who are involved in the Milei government, we were fearing of losing our children. So I have a kid which is 21, I have a kid which is 20, and I have a daughter which is 16. And if Argentina would have continued the way we were continuing with the previous government, I would have asked my kids to leave. And you were asking me what's happening with that, and now the kids are coming back. I think that's the most amazing thing that we're doing. Sorry, I apologize for getting emotional, but I feel it's so close to the reason I'm in this government. And the only thing I want is to grow up with my kids close to our family. And this is what the Argentines were losing. I mean, and I have the brother of my wife lives in Madrid. I have a brother that lives in Washington. And we're seeing our nieces on the Zoom, and we want them to be close to us. And for that, Argentina has to be a vibrant place, a meritocratic place, a place with opportunities, with growth. And once I was, basically, I think it was at the end of 24, I was coming back with Javier from a conference. And you're always kind of doing Twitter and looking at things. And then a survey popped up, and it said whether the young people were wanted to leave the country. And then with the Kirchnerista, 75% of the children were leaving the country. I mean, the university, a private university where I teach in Buenos Aires, we were teaching the guys and they were all leaving. And this survey said that 75% of the kids wanted to stay in Argentina. And Milei says, we've done all these things. We've brought down poverty. We've brought down inflation, the economy is growing, but this is the most important thing that we're doing, no? And he doesn't have kids, but for those of us who have kids, and I have kids in the age in which probably I would have lost them, I think this is a fundamental thing, and I think it's the fundamental reason why people support Milei, because he thinks he's opening a path for our kids to stay.